Hello, everyone. I'm Juan Echanove, Care Senior Director for Food and Water Systems. And today we are going to talk about exactly that, food systems. What does it mean? Many of you have probably heard already about food systems, but what are they? Food systems, let me start by saying, are the places, the people, the activities that bring us food. They make food available in diverse ways and influence and shape the choices we make about what we eat and when we eat and how we eat. So they are very complicated and they are constantly changing, comprising a host of moving and interconnected pieces. And the first thing to keep in mind is that even if food systems is a relatively new term, the things that this term tries to put together or refer to, things like agriculture, food safety, food security, and much more, are of course not new concepts. And actually they are concepts overlapping with each other. In fact, we could talk about systems within systems, and this may sound complicated, and in fact it is complicated. What you see here is also very complicated. It's a graphical representation or conceptual framework that the panel of experts of the Committee of Food Security, or CFS, which is the United Nations main forum for reviewing and following up food policies, did some years ago to try to describe what food systems are and how they work. Perhaps too complicated, right? Well, indeed, food systems are super complex, but I believe we can try to jointly learn what they are in a less painful manner if we go step by step. So let's start with the first set of pieces, which are those in the upper arrow in this graphic. These are what we call drivers of food systems, or in other words, the external forces influencing food systems like climate change, population growth, culture, and much more that we will see later. Then we have also this other box here, which refers to the food supply chains, which are all the elements of food systems needed to make food available to us. Things like farming, food processing, storage, distribution, retailing, food supply chains, food availability. Good. And then we have this other block in the conceptual framework developed by the Committee of Food Security, which is the food environments that we will also discuss later. And we will see what actually it means, this food environment or food accessibility. The next block here refers to all these things in the right of the chart that relate to how food is consumed, things like nutrition, diets, how consumers behave, etc. So food utilization. And finally, we have this long box below referring to the policies and the institutions shaping food system policies. So these are the 5 main building blocks of food systems: the drivers, the food supply chains that make food available, the food environments that make food accessible, the ways food is utilized, and the political and institutional actions. But I personally prefer to represent this in a different way: a shelf of external drivers influencing food systems, and then all these intrinsic components of food systems overlapping and relating to each other, because this is in fact how they work together in real life: food availability, accessibility to food, food utilization, and the political and institutional actions. So let's go and take a deeper dive on each of these components of food systems, starting with the external drivers. What are these external drivers? These are external issues that shape the way our food systems work. Things like environmental and biophysical factors, like climate biodiversity or soil health. Also cultural factors like people that consider some food more desirable than other, or gender norms related to who buys or cooks food. Also the presence of infrastructure to transport food, or demographic patterns like changing urban populations or average family size, as well as the financial viability to support food systems and many more. Let's pick a few examples of these drivers that I just mentioned, starting perhaps with the environmental and biophysical drivers, or maybe more specifically, climate change. I actually like drawing sketches to illustrate concepts, and you will see here quite a few of those along the presentation. This one is trying to illustrate how climate drives food systems, or to be more precise, how it influences agriculture. Agriculture and livestock are responsible for about 1/5 of global greenhouse emissions that cause climate change. And these emissions are caused by things like the methane gas emitted by the livestock poop or the CO2 emitted when forests are chopped down to expand agricultural land, or the emissions from agricultural tractors, for instance. But food systems are not only responsible for climate change, they are also victims, so speaking of it. Climate change impacts agriculture in many, many ways. The poorest countries are, in fact, the hardest hit, with reductions in crop yields in most tropical and subtropical regions due to the decreased water availability and new or change insect pest incidents, for instance. Climate change is already badly affecting agriculture, especially small-scale farmers worldwide. And as you can see in these figures, yields will likely continue declining in many places in the upcoming years. Demographic changes is another key driver of food systems. And now, for the first time in history, there are more people living in cities and towns than in villages. And this means that agricultural land is cleaned up to expand built-up areas. Also, this means that more food is to be transported to cities and that less working force is available for agricultural activity. Also, food consumption behaviors change dramatically when people move from a rural context to big cities. And of course, the political and economical factors operating in every society are also key drivers, moving or bringing or affecting food systems one way or another. Let's think, for instance, on some of the key drivers of hunger in the world nowadays. One, of course, is climate change, as we talked already about. Another is political conflict and wars. And a third key issue is economic inequality. The COVID pandemic that we are now still living on has caused a global economic crisis of unprecedented levels, widening social disparity between the ultra-rich and the ultra-poor. More than 140 million people are estimated to be facing hunger crisis or worse right now. So we have to talk about drivers, external factors influencing food systems. Let's now consider the different elements of the food systems as such, one by one. Starting with the supply chain, or in other words, those elements related to the availability of food. Here we go with another of my sketches, simplifying how food supply chains look like. Food supply chains encompass everything from the seeds needed to grow crops to food being produced on farms, to food reaching the people who eat it. In other words, from farm to fork. For some foods, this journey includes multiple stages. Supply chains includes input supply, production, transportation, processing, packing, distribution. As we shall see later, food can also be lost at many points along the supply chain, and up to a third of all food produced is actually lost or wasted. Input suppliers that you see here in this sketch in the left hand are the people, the companies, the entities providing to the farmers those things they need in order to grow food. Things like seeds or feed for the cattle or fertilizers, equipment, technologies, knowledge. You can roughly classify also food producers in two wide categories. The small scale producers, you can see that in the sketch, and also the industrialized producers, which are mid or large scale producers. Food is not only produced locally in every country. It is, of course, also imported. The food, whatever it is originated from, small scale producers or large farms or imported, is either processed, as you see in the chart, or sold directly to consumers, such as the fresh food sold by farmers in street markets in many parts of the world. Food is also sold by retailers in small or large supermarkets or exported to other markets. And these are all the things which are illustrated in this sketch. But let's zoom in on the small scale producers, because they are in fact the vast majority of the farmers worldwide. Well above 80% of the world's 570 million farms are small holdings. That is, farms less than 2 hectares in size. In sub-Saharan Africa, South India, and many other parts of the world, smallholder farmers are a backbone in the fight against hunger and poverty. In these countries, they produce about 80% of the food consumed by the population. Yet, market systems work against them, as we will see now. Let's take a look on how small-scale producers relate to the other actors in the supply chain, starting with the input suppliers. How small-scale producers access the seeds, the land, the fertilizers, the tools, and the finance that they need to farm their lands or grow their animals? Well, let's consider this. According to the 2019 Access to Seeds Index, less than 10% of the world's smaller farmers have access to improved quality seeds that can have hunger or tolerate climate change impacts. In fact, what happens is that the global market of seeds from agriculture seeds, for agriculture seeds, I mean, it's basically an oligopoly controlled by a very limited number of companies, as you can see in the graphic. The same happens, in fact, in the case of global supply of fertilizers or pesticides, machinery, and many other key inputs for agriculture. This immense concentration of power in the hands of a very limited number of large corporations play at the disadvantage of small-scale producers, which cannot negotiate prices or benefit from a more diverse or locally based sourcing. Small-scale producers also have to compete with large-scale producers and farming corporations. And this is driven, amongst many factors, by the so-called land grabbing phenomenon, which refers to large-scale land acquisitions, mainly by private investors, but also by public investors and agribusinesses that buy farmland or lease it on a long-term basis to produce agricultural commodities. Small farmers sometimes are only able to produce enough food for self-consumption. Often, they can still sell some surpluses in the local markets, but what about selling their production and raw materials to the food processing industry? Well, the challenge here is that, just like what we said when talking about input suppliers, also in the food retailing industry, in recent decades, we can see a massive concentration of power in a very limited number of companies. You may see many brands in your local supermarket, but at the end of the day, most of those brands belong to a very limited number of large-scale businesses or conglomerates. This market concentration reduces the bargaining power of the small-scale producers, so they cannot negotiate better prices or simply find their niche in the food systems, as they have to compete with these colossal forces. So, what the small-scale food producers can do to keep afloat in face of these large-scale forces around them, like global seeds or fertilizer companies, or investors acquiring huge agricultural estates, or gigantic companies controlling the bulk of the food industry? It seems the whole food supply chain is into economies of scale right now. Well, there is little an individual farmer can do vis-a-vis these forces, but the magic here, it's actually in the numbers. Remember, majority of food producers globally are small-scale producers. So if they operate jointly, they too can reach economies of scale. And how they can operate jointly? Via farmer organizations such as farmer associations and cooperatives. A cooperative is an independent private business association of individuals who are at once the members and the consumers of the goods they produce and or the services they provide. Small businesses can achieve economies of scale this way, competing with large corporations in the market. Farmers in agricultural cooperatives can get access to supply and markets that are otherwise beyond their reach. Agricultural co-ops provide also services that can contribute to the income or to the productivity for small-scale farming. And there is also farmer associations, and the role of farmer associations is to represent farmers in order to ensure their participation in the formulation and implementation of agricultural and food system policies. Well, we have talked about availability of food, or in other words, about food supply chains. Let's now focus on food accessibility, or what is also sometimes called in food system theory, food environments. Food environments refers to the places, the spaces in which people obtain or prepare or consume their food. This includes physical and economical access to food, addressing questions such as, is food available and what does it cost relative to other goods? What types of vendors are selling it, and are the products appealing or are they convenient? So food environments also refers to the promotion, the labeling, the advertising, and the information provided to consumers about food. For instance, via billboards or supermarkets or packing, etc. Food quality and food safety aspects are also key aspects of this. Let's go back to the sketch and look now a bit to analyze how consumers access food. One aspect to this is where food is coming from, or in other words, global food trade. And the trend globally is that many developing countries that in the past used to be net exporters of food, nowadays import more than the food they export. Look at this table about this chart about Africa, which used to be the continent, a food basket of the world. Already by the late 90s, Africa was importing slightly more food than what it was exporting. And now the difference is much wider. Africa nowadays is heavily dependent in food imports. Another interesting issue to look at is where do consumers buy their foodstuffs? And traditionally, in the global south, people were buying their food mostly from the markets, in the street markets or in small shops like those here in the picture. But this is changing dramatically, especially in the urban areas, where more and more people now buy their food in supermarkets. And this has all sorts of implications in terms of diets, because supermarkets sell more processed food, and it also impacts the way small-scale farmers access the markets. As we saw before, unless small-scale farmers operate collectively in co-ops or in associations, they may have had a very hard time to become suppliers to the supermarkets because they not produce enough in terms of scale. Another worrisome feature of food systems nowadays, especially in US and in other countries in the global north, are the so-called food deserts. Food deserts are geographic areas where residents have few or maybe no options for accessing affordable and healthy food. Food deserts like suppliers of fresh food, such as meats or fruits or vegetables, the vanishment of food markets and traditional groceries and specialized food shops, which has been replaced by supermarkets selling almost exclusively high processed food, is the main driver of this trend. Here in this map, you can see in the area in green the massive extension of food deserts across the US. Let's now move to another component of the systems, food utilization. And when we talk about food utilization, we are referring to the consumer behaviors such as food preparation, meal practices, for instance, putting food in a refrigerator, or diets, or also food taboos, why not to eat this or that dish, or food waste, and also diets and nutrition aspects. In short, food utilization refers to how we eat. When people's diet lacks the nutrition they need, we talk about undernutrition. And undernutrition is probably the most clear indication on how unequal and unfair our food systems are. We produce in the world enough food to feed everyone, but according to the last Global Nutrition Report, 1 in 9 people in this world, or 820 million people worldwide, was hungry in 2020. 144 million children under 5 are stunted, and 467 million wasted. These increases are partially related to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which continues to highlight the weaknesses of current food systems and health systems as well. A surplus of nutrition cases causes overnutrition, including overweight and obesity. The world is currently facing actually an overweight pandemic. There are more than 38 million children under 5 who are overweight. And the problem is not just happening in Europe or US. This is a global phenomenon, as you can see in the map. Latin America, the Arab world, and increasingly sub-Saharan Africa now see high percentages of the population obese. More than 1/3 of urban residents in urban centers in places in sub-Saharan Africa are now overweight. And this is also becoming a rural problem as well, with already 10% of rural dwellers in Africa obese. Obesity poses a major health risk, causing health disease, causing high blood pressure, diabetes, high blood cholesterol, and much more. The main drivers of this obesity pandemic is, of course, diet changes promoted by the consumption of sugar and fat-rich over-processed food products. The less we consume fresh and nutritious products from small-scale farmers, the unhealthier we become. A huge percentage of the food produced is wasted, as we said already. And a lot of this happens at the end of the process when restaurants, supermarkets, or final consumers throw food, waste it. US, for instance, wastes roughly 40% of its food, and much of it is perfectly nutritious and edible. But also countries like India, China, or Japan waste food at enormous scale. Reducing food waste in all parts of the food system is a very important part of reducing the environmental impact of agriculture by reducing the total amount of water, land, and other resources used. But let's move to another component of the food systems, the political decisions and actions that shape them. There are lots of different types of policies influencing food systems. Once I tried to classify them all, and here you can see my attempt with some examples for each type. Some policies are targeted to individuals or specific categories of people, such as farmers or processors or consumers, etc. They may consist on either incentivizing certain actions, like transfers such as providing subsidies to farmers to grow healthy products, or via discounts such as tax incentives and price reductions, or can be in-kind incentives, like donating seeds to the farmers, for instance. In other cases, the aim of the policy is to disincentivize certain behaviors, such as imposing higher taxes on unhealthy food, or penalties, like penalizing polluting food industries, for instance. There is also a subset of policies which are not targeting individuals nor specific categories of people, but addressing the society as a whole, such as developing public infrastructure like roads or ports that will also facilitate better transportation of foodstuffs, or promoting public services such as better animal health or food system policies or food education. Well, we have already looked into all these complex components of food systems, so it seems we have done a quite fine job trying to understand how they work. But do we? I would say that not really, because we are in this analysis still missing a crucial factor. And that factor is that women are key actors in every part of the food systems, in every of these components that we have been describing. Almost half of small farmers globally are women. And women are also the majority of the workers on food processing industry and in food retailing, and of course, half of food consumers. But women are in most societies also responsible for food preparation and for feeding the children. But despite their massive importance, women's contribution to food systems are often undervalued, underpaid, and overlooked. Wherever in the food systems we will look, we will find gender inequality. Gender-based discrimination continues to drive food and nutrition insecurity, and gender-based violence is perpetuated and prevalent in food systems. If we focus on women farmers in the supply chains, they do have unequal access compared to man farmers to land, to credit, to services, and to all the different types of assets that could increase their yields and their incomes. Women and girls also have less access to food and are more vulnerable to chronic food and nutrition insecurity. Women high domestic work burden and lack of support from men in childcare has also dire consequences for children's nutrition and long-term health. And they are often women the last to eat and the least. Finally, the food system policies are very often gender biased due to the lack of capture and analysis of data on the gender and age-based dimensions of food systems, and due also to the lack of voice and low representation of women in decision-making positions in food systems. And this is why, in order to transform food systems and make them genuinely equitable, we need to place gender justice at the core. And also we need to remember that if women farmers could have equal access to resources like land, credit, education, extension, these workers could increase their food production by 20 or more percent, lifting more than 150 million people out of hunger, according to some calculations by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. In CARE, we have put together a strategic framework that we call She Feeds the World, which aims to help the more than 800 million people that go to bed hungry, not because the world does not produce enough food, but because of global injustice. She Feeds the World, our CARE's framework, brings together the best of CARE practices and experiences and those from our partners and our best approaches in an integrated framework. So She Feeds the World is based on an integrated model involving interventions that incorporate gender, governance, and resilience as common approaches to address these food system drivers that we were discussing before, and focusing across different areas of change, each of them related to the different aspects of food systems that we were considering in the analysis before. So women empowerment at the core of the model, addressing also inequality in productive resources, access to markets, nutrition, social protection. So each of them is addressing one of these components of food systems that we have described before. Thank you so much for your attention, and let's make the best possible choices in the way we as consumers, as actors in food systems, operate in the food systems to make them more fair and more equitable. Thank you so much.